Before we get into that story, if you enjoy dark narratives, true mysteries, and stories that reveal the hidden side of humanity, sign up now and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any stories that deserve to be told or forgotten. And feel free to comment, where are you watching from? I want to know what part of the world you're walking down these halls with me from. The Winchester fortune was born from the dry sound of a gunshot, a short metallic sound that pierced flesh, bone, and destiny. In the United States of the late 19th century, that sound was synonymous with power, expansion, and death, even if no one liked to say the last part aloud. Sarah Lockwood Winchester learned early on that money could buy almost anything except silence. Born into a cultured family, raised among sheet music and philosophy books, she never touched a gun. Yet every dollar that sustained her life came from the incessant repetition of that distant crack. The Winchester rifle was not just a product, it was a national symbol. And symbols come at a price. When she married William Wirt Winchester, heir to the arms empire, Sarah believed that life would finally fall into place along predictable lines. An elegant home, a powerful surname, children who would inherit the world. But reality presented itself abruptly and cruelly. Their first daughter died as a baby. A few years later, William fell rapidly ill, consumed by a disease that doctors couldn't precisely explain. They could only watch as he faded away. From that point on, fortune ceased to seem like a blessing. Sarah began to occupy large, empty halls, surrounded by servants who avoided meeting her gaze. The nights became too long. There was no more music. Only the sound of the wind rustling through the windows, and sometimes something harder to define, as if the house breathed when no one was looking. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, the Winchester family story was told very differently. Newspapers extolled the industrial empire, politicians toasted the company that had helped civilize the West, and investors spoke of progress. None of these words mentioned the bodies scattered across battlefields, Indian trails, or dusty saloons, but they existed, and for some, they had not been forgotten. The brewing conflict was not visible. There were no declared villains or explicit threats. Sarah's antagonist had no defined face. It was made of accumulation, unburied deaths, unspoken guilt, questions no one dared to ask. How much of the country's pain was hidden beneath that surname? It was in this state of suspense that Sarah received the suggestion that would change everything. A doctor, too embarrassed to bear the weight of his own words, hinted that the widow's suffering might have origins beyond the physical. A medium in Boston confirmed what she had never put into words. The Winchester fortune carried a debt, and the dead, according to him, were collecting. There was no dramatic scene or shouting. Sarah simply listened and decided to act. A few months later, she left everything behind and moved to California. He bought a modest property in San Jose, an ordinary house with nothing to suggest what was to come. He didn't explain his plans to anyone. He simply ordered the work to begin. What seemed like mourning soon turned into obsession. Constructions that defied architectural logic, corridors that led to walls, staircases that ended at the ceiling, doors open to emptiness. Everything was done in silence, day and night, as if stopping meant dying. To the workers, it was just well-paid work. To the neighbors, the eccentricity of a rich and lonely woman. But for Sarah Winchester, each hammer blow was a deal. Each new room, an attempt to deceive something invisible that was slowly approaching. She wasn't running from death. She was trying to occupy it. As the mansion grew chaotically, so did the past. Forgotten names, decimated peoples, soldiers who never returned home. The fortune continued to yield millions, and the house continued to grow, as if both were bound by a pact that no one dared break. None of this was supernatural in Sarah's eyes. It was consequence, action, and reaction. An empire built on blood required constant movement to avoid collapsing, and without even realizing it, she was building not just a house, but a labyrinth. perhaps to imprison ghosts, or to never find her way out. The California that Sarah Winchester found lacked the understated elegance of the East Coast. San Jose still smelled of grime, freshly cut lumber, and raw ambition. Progress was fast-paced but unfinished. Makeshift railroads, cities growing before they even had an identity. It was the ideal place for someone who wanted to disappear in plain sight. The mansion, initially unassuming, began to expand organically and unsettlingly. There were no official blueprints. Orders came directly from Sarah, almost always at night. The carpenters learned not to ask questions. Some tried to suggest structural corrections, align staircases, eliminate unnecessary doors. They were dismissed the next day. Among the workers, nicknames emerged: the house that never sleeps, the labyrinth, the place where nothing ends. No one stayed too long. Those who remained reported a constant feeling of disorientation, not just physical but mental. Hours seemed to slip away inside the building. Sounds echoed where there shouldn't be any. Sarah observed everything from a distance, always dressed in black, her hair neatly tied back. She didn't shout, she didn't argue. Her authority came from absolute control. She paid above average, but demanded total obedience. For her, each man there wasn't a builder. He was a temporary cog in something bigger. Few knew of her nightly routine. When the hammering ceased, Sarah would retreat to a small, secluded room where she held solitary sessions. There were no witnesses, only rumors. Some said she wrote names in thick notebooks. Others swore they had seen her change entire projects after sleepless nights, as if she had received instructions. During this same period, the past she was trying to reorganize began to take on more defined contours. The westward expansion had been violent, and the Winchester rifle had played a central role in it. Indigenous peoples were driven from their lands, entire families decimated in confrontations that newspapers called necessary. Official history spoke of manifest destiny. Real history spoke of survivors. One of those survivors was Thomas Caldwell, a former Union soldier, now an informal investigator hired by families seeking answers about forgotten deaths. Caldwell didn't believe in curses. He believed in clues, and the trail of the Winchester repeating arms repeatedly surfaced in his investigations. He arrived in California following scattered reports: an eccentric widow, an absurd mansion, unlimited money. Caldwell didn't see madness there. He saw structured guilt. For him, Sarah Winchester wasn't running from ghosts, but trying to organize an impossible accounting. Another character who began to orbit the mansion was Elena Cruz, the daughter of Mexicans displaced during the American territorial expansion. She worked as a temporary cook and observed everything with silent attention. Elena recognized that type of construction, not as architecture, but as an offering. In her culture, it was believed that the dead needed paths so as not to get lost or not to return. She noticed details that others ignored: the obsessive repetition of the number 13. Windows positioned so that light never fully entered. Rooms created and abandoned before being used. Everything seemed to obey a logic that was neither American nor European. It was something hybrid, born from the violent cultural clash that founded that country. Sarah, for her part, rarely interacted directly with these people, but she observed. She knew that the world around her was full of stories that would never make it into books. And that was precisely what made her task impossible to complete. The mansion was becoming a reflection of the country itself. Chaotic growth, overlapping layers of wrong decisions, constant attempts at correction without ever erasing the original mistake. Each new corridor concealed another. Each solution created two problems. Caldwell began to realize that the house wasn't just a product of Sarah's mind, but of the collective pressure of an unresolved past. Elena felt the same, though she didn't put it into words. For both of them, that construction wasn't an eccentricity. It was a symptom, and Sarah Winchester continued steadfastly, expanding the physical world to contain a moral world that no longer fit within her. The question that was beginning to form silently was simple and dangerous. What if the house wasn't being built to keep the dead away, but to keep them close? The mansion could no longer be understood as a work of art. It had become an organism. It grew without pause, swallowing old corridors, creating detours where straight lines had once been. For the men who worked there, the conflict had ceased to be merely physical, carrying beams, erecting walls, obeying strange orders, and had become internal. Something in that house demanded constant attention, as if any carelessness were an affront. Sarah Winchester intensified the pace of construction. Shifts were doubled. New materials arrived daily. There was no financial justification. The fortune seemed inexhaustible, but there was urgency. She walked through the house with calculated steps, changing decisions mid-project, ordering the destruction of recently completed parts. She didn't explain. She simply reacted, as if responding to invisible signals. The first major obstacle arose when a worker fell from an interior scaffold. It wasn't high. The fall shouldn't have been fatal. Still, the man died instantly. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah ordered the body to be removed quickly and the work to continue that same day. No pause, no ceremony. For Caldwell, that was a wake-up call. Accidental deaths happened on construction sites, but the widow's behavior wasn't that of someone trying to avoid risks. It was that of someone accepting losses as part of the process. He began cross-referencing dates, accidents, and architectural modifications. He noticed an unsettling pattern. Each death, each worker's disappearance, was followed by a specific expansion of the house, almost always in areas with restricted access. Caldwell attempted to make direct contact with Sarah. He was received politely, but distantly. She listened to his questions without interrupting, her eyes attentive, but without surprise. When he mentioned the Winchester rifle and its consequences, she did not defend herself. She simply ended the conversation. The following day, 2 new wings began to be erected. Meanwhile, Elena Cruz began to feel that the house was changing. Not physically, emotionally. The hallways seemed narrower, even when they hadn't been altered. Doors creaked without wind. Tools were found in places where no one had been. She noticed that the workers avoided certain paths, creating alternative routes purely by instinct. The conflict deepened when a fire broke out in a newly constructed wing. The flames spread quickly, but died down just as fast, as if they had been contained from the inside out. No clear cause was identified. Sarah ordered immediate reconstruction with subtle changes: sealed windows, inverted staircases, a series of false doors. These decisions began to generate resistance. Some workers refused to continue, others demanded double pay. Sarah met the demands without hesitation. The money solved the external problems, but not the internal ones. The tension increased. The house absorbed human conflicts and returned them in the form of disorientation, accidents, and silent fear. Caldwell realized that his investigation was shifting from historical to contemporary. The mansion wasn't a monument to the past, it was an ongoing conflict. He began interviewing former employees, gathering accounts of sounds, peripheral visions, and lapses in memory. Nothing supernatural enough to become legend, but too human to be ignored. Sarah, for her part, began to make mistakes. For the first time, a staircase led to a space she didn't recognize. A room appeared where she didn't remember ordering anything. Instead of retreating, she moved forward. She ordered further expansion, as if she could regain control through excess. The central conflict was clear. The more Sarah tried to contain the consequences of the Winchester fortune, the more they materialized around her. The house, built to confound death, was beginning to confound its own creator. Elena felt this acutely one morning when she found Sarah standing before a newly erected wall, touching the wood with the palm of her hand, motionless. There was no sadness there. There was calculation and something akin to apprehension. The conflict was no longer between the living and the dead, past and present, reason and belief. It had become a direct struggle between control and collapse. And the mansion, now too vast to be comprehended by a single person, began to choose its own path. With the uncontrolled expansion of the mansion, conflicts inevitably began to branch out. What had once seemed like an isolated obsession of Sarah Winchester now affected everyone around her, creating parallel stories that silently intertwined with the core of the building. The first subplot to gain traction was that of the workers who remained. A small group decided to stay despite their fear, drawn by the generous pay and the difficulty of finding stable employment in that unstable region of California. Among them stood out Jacob Miller, an experienced carpenter who had lost two brothers in conflicts in the West. For Jacob, that house was just another belated consequence of the violence the country pretended to have overcome. Jacob began noting details that bothered him. Measurements that changed on their own, doors that didn't align with the hallways, rooms that seemed to shrink after being finished. He tried to impose logic, correct angles, but whenever he did, Sarah ordered the destruction of that specific part. Jacob's subplot wasn't one of horror, but of technical frustration, a man struggling against a construction project that rejected order. Meanwhile, Elena Cruz began to experience a growing internal conflict. She recognized familiar signs in Sarah's obsession, similar to the appeasement rituals her grandmother had described in Mexico: building to distract, occupying space so that the dead wouldn't feel forgotten. But there, everything was excessive. There was no pause, no closure. For Eleanor, the problem wasn't building, it was never finishing. She began leaving small objects in strategic locations: a red ribbon, a glass of water, discrete symbols representing passage and boundaries. None of this was part of a formal ceremony. It was instinct. Curiously, in these areas, accidents temporarily ceased. Elena didn't tell anyone about this, but she began mapping these points, creating her own interpretation of the house. Meanwhile, Caldwell faced external resistance. His investigations began to unsettle former business partners of Winchester Repeating Arms. Anonymous letters arrived at his lodgings, suggesting he abandon the case. A local newspaper refused to publish his article about the link between the family's fortune and documented deaths in the West. The conflict expanded beyond the mansion, revealing a collective effort to keep certain truths buried. The time pressure became concrete when Sarah announced a new phase of construction, a set of internal corridors that had to be completed before the following winter. The deadline was unrealistic. The urgency didn't stem from the weather, but from something only she seemed to perceive. The accelerated pace led to exhaustion, mistakes, and open tension among the workers. The subplots began to converge when Jacob disappeared for an entire night inside the mansion. He was found at dawn, disoriented, in a space that officially didn't exist in the construction records. He didn't remember how he got there. The next day, he quit his job and left San Jose without looking back. This event connected the narrative threads. Caldwell saw it as proof that the house was actively becoming dangerous. Elena interpreted it as a warning, not from the dead, but from the structure itself, reacting to the imbalance. Sarah, in turn, reacted by further expanding that specific area, as if trying to contain something that had escaped control. The subplots didn't accumulate by chance. Each one reinforced the idea that the mansion wasn't just a stage, but an agent. It affected decisions, created fear, and provoked estrangement. The pressure of time, external resistance, Elena's silent rituals, and Jacob's escape all pointed to the same central problem. It was not possible to indefinitely sustain an attempt to compensate for the past without confronting its causes. And yet, Sarah Winchester pressed on, aware that stopping was not an option, because stopping would mean allowing everything she had been avoiding to finally catch up with her. The turning point didn't come as an explosion, a fire, or a public tragedy. It came as silence, For 3 consecutive nights, Sarah Winchester ordered the work to cease after sunset. No hammers, no saws, no hurried footsteps in the unfinished corridors. The mansion, accustomed to constant movement, sank into an uncomfortable stillness. For the workers it was a relief. For Sarah it was a test. On the first night, nothing happened. On the second, small signs appeared. Half-open doors that had been closed, inexplicable drafts, a staircase that creaked even without weight. On the third night, Sarah finally confirmed what she feared. The movement wasn't keeping the dead away. It was keeping something under control. She was walking alone down a narrow corridor when she noticed the floor had been altered. Not by workers. The planks were there, but arranged in a sequence she had never ordered. The pattern formed something recognizable. Dates. Specific years. They all coincided with documented massacres in the westward expansion. Confrontations where the Winchester rifle had been decisive. For the first time since her husband's death, Sarah took a step back. The next day, he called Caldwell, not as a researcher being confronted, but as someone who needed to confirm facts he had avoided facing. He handed her an old, black-covered notebook he had kept hidden. Inside were names, places, death tolls. These weren't psychic visions, they were historical records, cross-referenced with military reports and Winchester Company contracts. The revelation was brutal in its simplicity. Sarah would never truly believe in ghosts. The story of the curse was convenient. What motivated her was not fear of the supernatural, but the certainty that her fortune existed because thousands had no choice, defense, or justice. The real turning point came when Caldwell realized something even more disturbing. The areas of the house that Sarah was expanding didn't just correspond to the deaths. They corresponded to the places where no one was ever held accountable. Where there was no trial, compensation, or even official record. The mansion was not a labyrinth to confuse spirits. It was a distorted memorial, built to fill the space left by the lack of repair. Elena, hearing fragments of this conversation, understood the central mistake. In their traditions, honoring the dead required public acknowledgement, not concealment. Sarah was trying to repay a historical debt alone, and that made the house endless. The unexpected event that sealed the turning point happened that same night. One of the recently expanded internal corridors partially collapsed. There were no deaths, just a controlled collapse, as if the structure itself had chosen where to fall. When the dust settled, something that hadn't been in any of the plans was revealed, a central, large, empty space. There were no false doors, there were no detours, just a stark, silent hall in the heart of the mansion. Sarah stood before that void for long minutes. For the first time, she didn't order immediate construction. She didn't try to fill it. She didn't deviate from the path. She understood too late that the problem wasn't a lack of paths. It was the absence of a center. The house had grown to avoid confrontation. Now it offered one. The direction of history changed there. It was no longer a matter of continuing to build in order to survive, but of deciding whether one would have the courage to stop and publicly acknowledge the weight of the Winchester fortune. And this decision, Sarah knew, would affect not only her life, but the way an entire country dealt with what it preferred to forget. The discovery of the central space immediately changed the dynamics of the mansion, not through visible changes, but through what ceased to happen. For the first time in years, no new construction orders were given the following day. The workers awaited instructions that never came. The silence, once fleeting, settled in as a constant presence. Sarah Winchester isolated herself. Not in a specific room, but in the house itself. She walked through corridors she herself had created, now observing them as if they belonged to someone else. Each detour seemed less necessary, each false door a confession. The mansion had ceased to be a tool and had become evidence. Caldwell reacted practically. With the notebook in hand, he began to organize Sarah's data into a coherent dossier. Dates, contracts, military campaigns, territorial expansion. The pattern was irrefutable. He realized that disclosing it would mean direct confrontation with powerful interests. Newspapers, investors, and politicians had profited from the same silence that had sustained the Winchester fortune. The first external consequences didn't take long to appear. A company representative visited San Jose under the pretext of concern for Sarah's health. The questions were vague, but the intention was clear: to assess risks. Caldwell was discreetly informed that his presence there was being monitored. Elena, for her part, felt the change in a more subtle way. The small rituals she had been maintaining had lost their function. The areas that previously seemed to calm the house were now neutral. For her, this confirmed what she had suspected. The imbalance did not come from the dead, but from the denial of the living. Without constant movement, the mansion did not react. It merely existed. Among the workers, the mood changed rapidly. Some resigned, fearing the disruption was temporary and that something worse was to come. Others stayed, curious. The house no longer seemed hostile, but strangely exposed, as if it had been opened from the inside. Sarah finally called a meeting. Not to announce the resumption of construction, but to lay off half the team. She paid everyone in full with bonuses. No explanation. The decision was interpreted as a sign of emotional collapse. Rumors began to circulate in San Jose. The eccentric widow was losing control. Internally, however, Sarah faced something more difficult than fear. She faced responsibility. Each hallway now brought back questions that had previously been muffled by the noise of construction. If the house was a memorial, why did it need to be secret? If it was a restoration project, why did no one but her know? The most profound impact came when she realized that stopping didn't end anything. The mansion didn't collapse. There was no invisible punishment. The world went on. This dismantled the justification that had sustained years of obsession. Caldwell presented him with a clear choice: transform that knowledge into a public record, or allow it all to be absorbed back into institutional silence. He offered no consolation, only consequence. That night, Sarah returned to the central space. She took only a lamp with her. She observed the bare walls, the unmarked floor, the ceiling too high to be intimate. There was no possible detour there, no useless staircase, no false door. For the first time, the mansion wasn't asking for more construction. It was asking for a decision. And Sarah Winchester understood that any path from then on would have a cost, but only one of them would stop fueling the same debt that had haunted her all her life. Sarah Winchester's overcoming of her struggles didn't come with immediate redemption or grand gestures. It came in the form of uncomfortable choices, made one by one, without the protection of excess. The first challenge was accepting that she couldn't continue acting alone. Sarah authorized Caldwell to organize the material publicly, albeit in a controlled manner. It was not a complete confession, but an initial break from silence. Reports began circulating among independent historians and small Western newspapers. The texts avoided direct accusations, but presented connections that were difficult to ignore. The reaction was swift. Letters arrived demanding clarification. Investors applied pressure. An informal company council suggested that Sarah permanently distance herself from any matter related to Winchester repeating arms. She accepted. For the first time, she relinquished power without attempting to replace it with indirect control. In the mansion, new challenges arose. Without constant expansion, the structure revealed real problems: corridors that hindered evacuation, unusable wings, dangerous spaces. Sarah ordered renovations, not to grow but to stabilize. False doors were sealed, useless staircases removed, not to erase the past, but to prevent it from continuing to cause damage. Elena Cruz was invited to stay permanently, not as a regular employee, but as a cultural mediator. Sarah acknowledged though without fully verbalizing it, that her understanding of the past was incomplete. Elena helped reorganize certain spaces, not with symbols, but with function. Open areas, clear circulation, natural light whenever possible. Sarah's growth became visible in her daily actions. She began receiving visitors, something unthinkable months before. Historians, local journalists, community leaders, she offered no excuses. She offered access. The mansion, once closed and chaotic, became partially open, albeit under restrictions. Caldwell faced new obstacles. Attempts to discredit him arose. His work was called biased, emotional, and speculative. Sarah did not publicly defend him, but she secured funding for him to continue his independent research. It was support without scrutiny. The most difficult growth was internal. Sarah learned to sleep without the noise of construction. The nights were long but not unbearable. She walked through the house, recognizing mistakes without trying to correct them immediately. She learned to coexist with what could not be repaired by architecture. The mansion began to take on a different role. From an instrument of escape, it became a space for historical confrontation, still macabre in its form, but honest in its function. Not a labyrinth to deceive the dead, but a physical testament to what happens when a nation grows without looking back. Sarah Winchester did not absolve herself. She did not seek collective forgiveness. Her overcoming was accepting that true growth requires limits, and that some debts are not paid with excess, but with continuous recognition. The next challenge would be inevitable, to transform this silent change into something irreversible, before greater forces attempted to regain control of the narrative. The transformation of the mansion did not go unnoticed for long. What began as academic murmuring gained traction in regional newspapers, then in political circles. The narrative, once controlled, began to slip away, and with it, forces emerged determined to prevent the process from becoming definitive. Sarah Winchester received a formal notification. Legal representatives of the Winchester repeating arms demanded the immediate suspension of any public association between the mansion and controversial historical events. The tone was cordial, but the deadline was short. The implicit message was clear. The story needed to become profitable again, not true. Caldwell interpreted this as a prelude to the confrontation. He accelerated the organization of the files, prioritizing documents that were more difficult to contest: contracts, signed military reports, arms supply records. The material was ready for wider release, but it still lacked a point of impact, something that could not be easily suppressed. The build-up to the climax intensified when Eleanor discovered an old wing of the house that had remained closed since the early years. Not by ritual decision, but due to structural oversight. There, original artifacts were kept. Beams marked with dates, incomplete blueprints, Sarah's early notebooks, predating the narrative of the curse. These records revealed the ultimate truth that Sarah had never verbalized. The idea of the curse had been consciously constructed as a public shield, a convenient distraction so that no one would ask. Where did the fortune actually come from? The macabre architecture functioned as a spectacle. Sarah read those notebooks without trying to justify herself. She understood that by creating the myth, she had protected herself and the system that profited from silence. The preparation now required undoing this layer of lies, even if it destroyed her own image. The pace of the story accelerated. Invitations for official visits arrived. Proposals to transform the mansion into a tourist attraction emerged, all with clauses that diminished its historical significance. Sarah refused. Each refusal increased the pressure. She then made her riskiest decision. She authorized Caldwell to organize a public event at the mansion, an open historical presentation with access to documents without the involvement of the company or the state. It would not be a trial nor a spectacle. It would be an exhibition. The house responded in a curiously stable manner. No accidents, no collapses, as if at last it were aligned with the function that had always been imposed upon it. In the days leading up to the event, workers reinforced essential structures, not to hide flaws, but to ensure safety. Elena coordinated the flow of people, eliminating unnecessary detours. For the first time, the labyrinth led. It didn't confuse. Sarah walked through the mansion the night before the official announcement, not to watch nor to calculate, just to acknowledge what she had created. Every mistake, every excess, every failed attempt at compensation was there, now undisguised. The preparation was complete. The conflict would not be resolved with more building nor with more silence. The climax would require total exposure and the acceptance of consequences that could no longer be controlled. The day of the event dawned without ceremony. No bands, no official announcements in the streets. Still, people began to arrive early. Historians, independent journalists, curious onlookers, descendants of families affected by the armed expansion. There was no atmosphere of spectacle. There was a restrained, almost uncomfortable expectation. The Winchester mansion was different, still macabre in form, but now legible. Corridors led to bright spaces. Doors no longer deceived. The labyrinth had been tamed without being erased, like a scar kept in plain sight. Caldwell began the presentation without fiery speeches, just facts. Dates, maps, contracts. Each projected document dismantled a fragment of the carefully constructed national myth. The Winchester rifle ceased to be an abstract symbol of progress and assumed its real weight as a decisive tool of extermination and coercion. The most tense moment came when Sarah Winchester appeared. Not on stage, but among the audience. She was dressed simply, without the exaggerated mourning that had made her an almost legendary figure. She walked to the center of the space, the old, empty hall revealed in the collapse, and stood there. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't make an emotional confession. She simply authorized publicly that all her personal records be incorporated into the presented collection. She signed the document transfer right there. A short, irreversible gesture. The reaction was immediate. Representatives linked to the company tried to stop the event, citing legal issues. They were ignored. The public had already seen too much. Photographers captured every detail. Reporters noted names that had never appeared in textbooks. The final twist came when a man stood up in the audience, a direct descendant of an indigenous community forcibly displaced during armed campaigns in the West. He recognized one of the locations presented in the documents, not as a strategic military point, but as a destroyed village. For the first time, a direct link between paper and living memory became public. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Sarah watched without looking away. Her transformation was becoming visible there. She wasn't trying to control the narrative, only to sustain it. The climax wasn't physical confrontation or structural collapse. It was full exposure. The mansion, built to confuse and delay, now served as a stage for revelation. The macabre ceased to be a distraction and became context. Each useless staircase, each false door, was now understood as a reflection of a historical attempt to avoid responsibility. When the event ended, nothing was officially resolved, no sentence, no immediate compensation, but something essential had changed. The silence was broken publicly and in a documented way. Sarah Winchester didn't leave to applause. She left to observation, not as an eccentric, but as a conscious agent of a belated rupture. The central conflict ended there. Not with acquittal, nor with punishment, but with a clear transformation. The Winchester fortune ceased to be merely an inheritance. It became evidence, and the mansion finally fulfilled its definitive purpose. The consequences of the event at the Winchester mansion were not immediate, but they were profound. In the following days, national newspapers began to treat the case with calculated caution. Some downplayed it. Others questioned the credibility of the sources. Still, Something irreversible had occurred. Documents were in circulation, copies archived beyond the reach of any business counsel. Winchester Repeating Arms issued defensive statements, reaffirming its historical importance and shifting the focus to innovation and progress. No retraction, no admission. But the overly technical reaction only reinforced the public perception that there was something to hide. Sarah Winchester withdrew from public life, not out of fear, but out of consistency. She had fulfilled her role by opening access and refusing subsequent control. The mansion remained partially open, now accompanied by visible historical records, without fanciful narratives or spectacular tours. Those who entered were not seeking fright, they sought understanding. Caldwell saw his work gain recognition late in life. He didn't become a celebrity or a national hero, but he began to be cited in academic debates and parallel investigations. Other researchers began to follow the same trail, broadening the discussion beyond the Winchester name. The problem revealed was structural, not individual. Elena Cruz took on a silent but decisive role. She helped organize community gatherings at the mansion, bringing descendants of affected communities to speak, not as accusers, but as living memory. The house ceased to be a space of isolated guilt and became a place of continuous listening. As for Sarah, her conclusion was not redemption, but acceptance. She understood that no architecture, however complex, could replace historical justice. The mansion was not a solution, it was a testament to a prolonged wrong, and testimonies do not end stories, they prevent them from being erased. In the last years of her life, Sarah walked through the house without haste. She no longer measured spaces or calculated angles. She observed. Each uneven wall reminded her not of a ghost, but of a decision avoided for too long. The fortune remained. The Winchester name continued in the books. But now there was a visible fissure in the narrative, a point where progress was no longer indisputable. And that, for Sarah Winchester, was the most she could offer the world. Not silence, not illusory compensation, but the ultimate refusal to continue pretending that nothing had happened. Years later, visitors still walked through the Winchester mansion in unusual silence. They were no longer looking for doors leading nowhere or staircases that ended in emptiness. They stopped, above all, before the central hall, the space that had never been filled. The guides didn't talk about curses, they talked about choices, about a country that had grown too fast and a woman who tried alone to carry the weight of that in wood and nails. On certain afternoons, when the light streamed through the irregular windows, the emptiness seemed intentional, not as a flaw, but as a reminder. A space left open for that which cannot be resolved, only acknowledged. The mansion remained there, not as a labyrinth, but as a question. Now that you've journeyed through the corridors of this story, the question remains, how many other mansions still stand, silent, built upon decisions that were never questioned? The curse behind the Winchester fortune doesn't live in ghosts or legends. It inhabits choices, omissions, and narratives repeated until they seem like truths. Stories like this don't ask for fear, they ask for attention. If this narrative provoked discomfort, curiosity, or reflection, share it. Talk about it. Question the official versions of the stories you've learned. All change begins when someone refuses to accept silence as an answer. Share your interpretation, your doubt, or your disagreement. Stories only remain alive when they continue to be discussed, and some truths only exist because someone decided not to close the last door.